You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Welcome to Unbiased Science,
where we bring scientific method to the madness.
We're your hosts, Dr. Jess Steyer and
Dr. Sarah Scheinman.
Sarah, I love how cheesy you are when you say these things. It's so cute.
I'm still new, so this is still very exciting to me. I still can't believe I get to be on this show.
Oh my God, stop it. I'm pinching myself. Anyhow, so today we are going to tackle a topic that is very near and dear to my Jewish heart, which is anxiety and panic. This is something I've dealt with, I don't know, like my entire adult life, and I would say a good chunk of my teenage life as well. And we are joined today by an amazing clinical psychologist, Dr. Nicole Littman-Barilli. Did I get that right? I tried to practice this before we hit record. And so we're going to dive into this topic. But Nicole, can you just introduce yourself a little bit? Let listeners know who you are and what you do.
Sure. Yeah. So I am a clinical psychologist. I am based in New York and I'm licensed in New York so I can practice in the state. I specialize in the treatment of anxiety and mood disorders. I'm trained in cognitive behavioral therapy. And even more specific to that, I specialize in the treatment of obsessive compulsive disorder and other compulsive related disorders. So that's my day job. That's my day-to-day doing individual therapy and treating lots of anxiety.
Wow. I may be scheduling no, I'm just joking. But okay. And Nicole, we met via social media because Nicole, you're a fellow science communicator and your handle on Instagram is Feed Your Mental. Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, where did that come from?
Okay. So around, I guess, 2018 or so, I got really interested in nutrition and I was on social media and that seemed to be like a really big topic. And so I found myself kind of what I now know is like the wellness sphere. So I was really drawn to a lot of wellness influencers and sort of what they were talking about when it came to nutrition. I was also going through some like health related issues on my own, and they were sort of speaking my language because I wasn't getting any sort of relief from my doctors that I was seeing. So I kind of fell into some misinformation about nutrition. And then I ended up signing up to be a nutritional therapy practitioner through the Nutritional Therapy Association. I ended up doing their 9 or 10 month certification course and then found out a few months later that they weren't actually a legitimate association. And the only really way I found this out is because I started becoming interested in the diet mental health relationship. As I was already a psychologist and I was interested in nutrition. So I started seeing information about this relationship online. And then kind of soon after that, I started putting out content on Instagram related to this relationship. I was soon then contracted to start writing a course on this relationship, so the diet mental health relationship, from the Center for Nutritional Research. And as I was reading the actual research and writing the course, I was like, I did a 180. I was reading the research and I was like, all of these claims and information that I'm reading online are totally untrue. The research is completely suggesting otherwise, actually. And so I became less and less impressed with what I was seeing as I was reading and writing. And then that's when my content really started gearing more towards myth busting, because I realized I fell into a lot of misinformation. And so then I just redirected based on the information that I was learning. And I started putting out content about what I was reading through the research. And so I basically did an entire 180. And that's where the name came from, was Feed Your Mental, because I was interested in this relationship between diet and mental health. And so it's kind of led me to where I am now.
Wow. Okay. Well, we're definitely going to come back to that. We have to dig into that. And I want to hear about some of those myths and maybe we could bust some myths. I think that would be great. But Sarah, I know you love kind of setting the stage with some definitions. Are there any terms that we want to kick off with a clear definition?
Well, I think so. So primarily today we're talking about anxiety and anxiety disorders. So just to define what we're talking about when we say anxiety. So anxiety is a future-driven response to a diffuse threat. And this is distinct from fear, which is really more of an acute and short-lived response to like a very specific threat. And I just want to point out that when we talk about anxiety, like we all experience anxiety from time to time. Not all anxiety is bad. It's actually really an important evolutionarily adapted physical response that helps us to keep ourselves safe and out of danger. And I think we're all familiar with the fight or flight response. We've all heard of this. That comes in handy sometimes. Like sometimes our bodies need to be on high alert. And anxiety also, I think it's important to note, serves as a motivator for a lot of people on a daily basis. The problem is that sometimes anxiety can get out of hand, and then it can sort of become a little bit more of a pathology when it becomes persistent and excessive and leads to unrealistic worry about everyday things. Mm-hmm. And I believe, Nicole, correct me if I'm wrong, that anxiety disorders are the single most common mental illness affecting adults in the U.S. today. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And because Sarah, you're making a really interesting point, like not all anxiety is bad. It's sort of this evolutionary mechanism, right, that has protected us for many years. So Nicole, can you maybe from a clinical perspective, when do we venture into, okay, this is a disorder? There's something that's this is not, I don't want to say the word normal. You know what I mean? Let's like, what is normal anxiety or good anxiety versus a disorder?
Totally. Yeah. So I would say like healthy adaptive anxiety is something that is infrequent. It happens in appropriate context. So like, most people, let's say, would feel some anxiety related to, let's say they have a presentation they have to make and it's important to them, or they're running late to an appointment or something like that. Right. So there's an appropriate response given the context of the situation. And also the response is not severe and it's short-lived. Right. So when we're looking at like unhealthy anxiety, this is something that starts to become a lot more frequent for people, and it starts to become a lot more chronic, and it starts to become more severe. And then it starts really impairing their everyday functioning. So I don't start seeing people, people don't really come into my office unless it starts disrupting some aspect of their life. Usually that's their functioning in school, there's their functioning at work, there's their functioning in relationships, something about their life is now impaired because of the frequent and more severe anxiety that they are now experiencing.
Okay. And now can you help distinguish, and we actually got this question quite a bit, can you distinguish between anxiety and panic, or an anxiety disorder and a panic disorder? How are they similar and or distinct?
Sure. Okay. So panic disorder is really characterized by frequency, like very frequent panic attacks. And I'll define that also. So it's usually defined by two things: frequent panic attacks. And then there's usually fear associated with having an anticipated panic attack in the future, or some kind of worry associated with the consequence of having some sort of panic attack. So it's very common for people to fear the fear of the fear. That's what we kind of call it. It's this fear response around anticipated future related panic attacks. And also there's usually worry about the physical symptoms that people experience. So it's very common for people to think their heart racing and symbolizes maybe they're going to have a heart attack, as an example, or their labored breathing is going to make them pass out. So usually there's some kind of worried consequence associated with it. And a panic attack is defined by a very short, discrete period of time where there's an influx of usually a lot of different physical symptoms, and it peaks very quickly. So usually within 10 minutes. So this is like the most common symptoms people would feel are like racing heart, breathing is labored, trembling or shaking sort of feeling, sometimes like this fear of like loss of control or this derealization. Sometimes people feel like they're not really in their bodies when they sort of experience a panic attack. So we have to sort of see this like abrupt increase in fear and specific physical symptoms that peak at around 10 to 15 minutes. And then that subsides. So that's really what defines a panic attack. And that's what's really different from having anxiety and then also having panic disorder, because panic attacks can occur in multiple different kinds of anxiety disorders. But what defines a panic disorder is the fear of the anticipated panic attacks.
Yeah, I started a few years back, I started having panic attacks while I was driving. And then it turned into, it was such an acute period of this feeling of doom, like I was crawling out of my skin, I like exactly as you described it. And then I became terrified of driving because I was so scared of having another attack. And I've since, combination of some cognitive behavioral therapies and yes, some, pharmaceuticals have helped me get both my anxiety and my panic under control. But that's very, very interesting. So does panic then, does it fall under? Is it an anxiety disorder? I don't know if I'm getting too technical or
Yeah. So panic disorder is considered a subtype of an anxiety disorder. Okay. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Nicole, what are some other types of anxiety disorders that you see? You mentioned OCD.
Yes. So OCD is another subtype of anxiety disorder. And there's also social anxiety. There's specific phobias. That's when people have very specific fears of things. There's also generalized anxiety disorder. There's separation anxiety disorder. There's a lot of different subtypes of anxiety, and there's commonalities sort of between them, but then there's also these specific distinctions that make them for what, diagnostically for what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And when do symptoms for these disorders usually manifest? Like at what point in life? I mean, do you see these in children, adolescents, adults? I mean, I know it can affect anyone across the lifespan, but when do these symptoms typically start to manifest themselves?
Yeah. So that, I would say the answer to that question varies depending on biological influence and genetic influence. So it's more common to experience the onset of an anxiety disorder if you have a first degree relative that has an anxiety disorder as well. It's more common to experience the onset earlier in life, so in childhood or adolescence. And usually it becomes triggered by some kind of stressful event, some kind of activating event. And for other people, anxiety disorder can start to develop just in the context of a lot of stress or chronic stress. And sometimes that happens in combination with not having a lot of coping strategies or coping skills. So people who could go through, or you can go through sort of like a temporary, let's say, anxiety disorder, but that may be appropriate to your life circumstance, right? Like people who are going through really stressful circumstances in their lives, they can develop temporarily, right? Like this kind of short-term anxiety disorder. But that might be, again, like more appropriate given their life circumstances. So I would say like that kind of, that answer depends on where, like, is there a strong genetic component? Because usually we tend to sort of see that develop a little bit earlier if there is kind of this biological influence.
Thanks, Dad. There's a very strong genetic component. And actually my son, who's turning 8 in December, a couple of times we've been out in public and like at a restaurant or something, and he'll turn to me and he'll say, Mama, can we go outside? There's too many noises. Like I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed. And I'm impressed that he's even able to articulate that, but it's sort of on my radar. I'm thinking, his mama obviously have a very, I definitely have anxiety, an anxiety disorder. And I'm wondering if whether this is, is it potentially manifesting in him as early as, 7, 8 years old? And it sounds like it's possible. So just something that we're keeping an eye on.
It's also important, like, not to place blame when it comes to things like this. I mean, like it is like there is with regards to mood disorders, there's this model called the biopsychosocial framework, when it comes to mood disorders. So there's a biological part in that there is a genetic component, like Nicole mentioned. There's also the psychological component, which is what is going on in your mind. And then there's the social or the environmental aspect. So it's a lot of different things in combination that could trigger the manifestation of a mood disorder. And I mean, my mother has an anxiety disorder, and I do as well as my two younger brothers. So like there is a genetic component, but it's really important to not place blame solely on the parents or upbringing, because there are so many different things that go into this type of disorder.
Thank you for saying that. You're right. I shouldn't have said that. No, you're absolutely right. And Nicole, I'm wondering, how has the pandemic played into all of this? I mean, in your practice, have you seen changes, and I guess, it's interesting, just real quick, and then I would obviously certainly going to turn it over to you, because I hear a lot of people will talk about like long COVID. And I mean, I know that's something, and we've written about this. We're still kind of figuring out what that means. And there are a lot of non-specific symptoms, and some of those symptoms relate to anxiety. But it's like, how much of that is potentially a result of the virus itself versus the fact that we as a society just went through the collective trauma of a pandemic, So, yeah,
it's true. To be honest, I expected when the pandemic was like actively occurring in 2020, I half expected my contamination OCD patients to worsen. And I saw the opposite, and that was because I didn't think of this, but someone I was working with at the time was like, "Are you kidding? Like we're practicing the most safest way of not contaminating each other. This is amazing." So like for them, they were like, "Cool." I didn't really see. I would say like I didn't really see at the time anything sort of shifting. But what's interesting is that now what I'm seeing is that I noticed that like young adults are speaking to me more about how they feel like this year of their life, really kind of disturbed their social relationships and like their maybe academic relationship. Like there's some disturbance. And like now I'm hearing a little bit more of how they are noticing perhaps the impact of what that has felt like for them, because now they've had time to sort of like live and process and sort of think about things. So that's been kind of a little bit more interesting. And I couldn't have anticipated that necessarily as a consequence. But I would say this, I have a couple of people that I work with who experience some long COVID symptoms, and they have a little more anxiety in anticipation of, if they get reinfected again, are they going to experience the same exact symptoms? Is it going to be worse? Like, is there going to be other consequences? So for their context, I do see that there's a little more increased vigilance and anxiety, especially now we're getting more into fall weather and like flu season. And so I do see a little bit of an increase of worry related to like what's going to happen in the winter time.
That makes total sense. Sarah, I'm wondering if maybe, can you get into the neurobiology of anxiety just a little bit?
For people that are watching on YouTube, you definitely just saw me grin. Like, I love this stuff. This is my jam. All right. So let's talk about the biology of anxiety really quick. First, a quick neuroanatomy lesson. So there's a portion of our brain called the limbic system, which is located in the middle of our brain. And this is the part of the brain that handles our emotions. And it's a multi-region system that includes the hippocampus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the thalamus. And there's another region of our brain called the prefrontal cortex. It sits right here. And it's for people that are listening on the podcast. It's I was pointing to my forehead, like the front of the brain. I often forget this is not just this video and podcast. All right. Anyway, so the prefrontal cortex. This is the part of our brain that is very well developed, differentiates us from our ancestors or distantly related, primate relatives. So the prefrontal cortex is going to receive information from all of our environments to create a coherent interpretation of events. what happens with anxiety and patients that have anxiety disorders is that they have an overactive limbic system. So this emotion regulation system is kind of overactive, and it interferes with the way that emotions and decisions are processed by our prefrontal cortex. And this type of overactivation sort of amplifies the sense of threat and the degree of distress that are caused by certain innocuous stimuli. So very generally, that's kind of what's happening in the brain when you have an anxiety disorder. You're experiencing great degrees of anxiety. Is that like your emotion sensor is sort of like overpowering the parts of the brain that make decisions and process cognition.
Oh, Dr. Sarah just took us to school. Love it. Love it. Yeah. Well, okay. So interesting. So Nicole, first of all, I think I would love to like really shift gears soon and talk about like the nutrition anxiety link. But in light of what Sarah just shared about the neurobiology, can you sort of comment before we move on to the nutrition stuff, like how does that play into the ways that we then treat or cope with anxiety and, some of the therapies or therapeutics or, drugs that might be available to help us cope with this?
Yeah, sure. So the really gold standard behavioral treatment for anxiety disorders is exposure therapy. And exposure therapy really comes from behavior therapy, respondent conditioning. So this is coming from Pavlov. So it's really working on these ideas and principles of habituation and extinction. So essentially, like in exposure therapy, what we do is we gradually introduce and start exposing someone to the stimuli that they fear in a very systematic sort of way. And the important part of this is that the person cannot escape or do anything to try to lessen their anxiety in the moment, because the whole idea is the person has to really learn that it's okay to experience this anxiety and this fear, and their catastrophic, consequence is not necessarily going to happen. So we're trying to break this association between this is like technically a neutral stimulus and this feared response. That's the whole idea of what exposure therapy is really intended to do. So we apply exposure therapy actually to majority of anxiety disorders, but we tailor it specifically to whatever the, specific symptoms are, whatever the specific fears are. But that's really like the technique that we're using. So we use that in combination with relaxation training. So this is like breathing retraining. This is things like deep breathing. That's part of like emotion regulation skills. So it's helping a person like understand their own specific physiological responses, really bring awareness to their thought processes, like really bring an awareness to their behavioral responses so that they can start to undo like some of their initial responses and then relearn more adaptive ways of dealing with their fear and their anxiety.
Interesting. And then on the medication side of things, and just to be clear, so you don't prescribe medication, but I would imagine some of
don't prescribe. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But usually, so what's commonly prescribed is usually an SSRI. So it's an antidepressant. So this is something like a Paxil or Zoloft or something.
Lexapro.
Or Prozac.
Yeah.
Lexapro, yeah, totally. So that's usually prescribed. And then sometimes if there's a lot of frequent like acute anxiety, benzodiazepines are prescribed. Xanax. Yep. These are our friends. These can help people very much function, and very much also like it's really helpful when someone has severe anxiety and they can't engage in therapy, like to give them meds to help them reduce some of their anxiety so that they can actually start engaging in therapy and utilizing the techniques that we're talking about is really important.
Nicole, what I think is interesting is that I've heard, and I've sort of tried a few different medications, and it's like I've heard you have to see what works for you. And so interestingly, like my father, he was on Wellbutrin for many years. As I mentioned, I'm on Lexapro now. How is it? I don't know, like, can we just talk just briefly? And I don't know, Sarah, if this is more your territory, like why is it that certain medications work better for, different people?
Well, I will just say that everyone's brains are wired a little bit differently, right? So oftentimes the neurobiological basis of the anxiety, while I did explain broadly what causes it, it was a huge oversimplification because like there are many different parts of all of those brain regions that I mentioned, and each each part of the brain has different concentrations of different types of neurons that produce different neurochemicals called neurotransmitters, which are basically just little signaling molecules that allow the neurons to talk to each other. And some of these that have been implicated in anxiety include serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, acetylcholine. Specifically going back to serotonin, Nicole, you mentioned SSRIs. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors is what that stands for. And basically, what a medication like that does is just increases the availability of serotonin in the region between the neurons called the synaptic cleft. And this allows for the balance of the neurotransmitter in the regions of the brain that control emotions to be restored. And different patients with anxiety will have different imbalances of the specific levels of the neurotransmitters. And this could be part of the reason why different people respond differently to different types of medication when it comes to anxiety, because there is a neurobiological basis, but it is heterogeneous depending on the individual.
Love it. Beautiful. You're on fuego, Sarah. Okay. All right. So Nicole, I have to ask you, you did a post recently that I loved. I'm trying to pull it up here. So you you annotated a post that was originally shared by Mark Hyman. And so the original message was, the health of your gut plays a crucial role on your mental health. And then you edited it to say, the health of your gut plays a potentially small role on your mental health unless you have an inflammatory digestive disorder like IBS, IBD, or Crohn's. Can you take us through this a little bit?
I just want to say bravo from a scientific perspective.
Yeah, thank you.
So well done. I love it. Love the accuracy. 100%.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's the social media peer review process. Like that's what this is. Okay. Yeah, sure. So yeah, it is potentially small. Okay. So basically, the research related to currently the gut microbiome and specific mental health outcomes is so limited. And even just looking at anxiety, there's even less studies right now looking at this association and relationship between the gut microbiome and anxiety than there is with depression. I could talk a little bit more when it comes to this link between that and depression, just because we have a little bit more research on it. But so far, what's the only thing that's kind of only been demonstrated in an anxiety context is that if someone has an inflammatory digestive condition, which is one of these conditions like IBS or IBD or Crohn's or something, that's where there is this relationship between your gut health and your mental health. And I see this in my own practice with respect to like people who I have a few patients who have IBS and IBD who really contacted me specifically to manage their anxiety because of this relationship. And they do notice that when they are able to manage their anxiety better, they do have less digestive distress and less digestive symptoms. So there is a stronger association for people who do have digestive disorders and the prevalence of other mental health disorders, particularly depression and anxiety. There's higher prevalence rates for that. So that's really where currently that we see that this relationship is significant or makes any sort of like clinical sense. And in the relationship between the gut microbiome and depression, there's also really not much there. There was one potentially interesting study that was, I think it was published earlier this year, where the only sort of signal in the noise, so to speak, that was shown was that there seems to be this interesting association between the presence of a specific bacterial taxa and that being potentially causally linked to major depressive disorder. So that looks interesting, but again, we can't necessarily extrapolate that information and then say, oh, well, if we improve your gut microbiome, that means like your depression is going to improve, because talk about loosey-goosey definitions. There's like no good standardized definition for what a healthy gut microbiome means. And so it's very vague and we can't say anything related to like making any sort of clinical statements about this as if, you know.
I mean, but also like I would say this type of thing is so difficult to study. It's really hard to draw one-to-one causal link between the gut microbiome and disorders that are so multifaceted like depression and anxiety. I mean, you can try and model these things in a lab with mice, but it's so difficult. to be able to say for certain the causal role that your gut is playing in these types of illnesses. I mean, I think you spoke to that beautifully.
And Sarah, you you're lucky enough to not be on social media, but Nicole, I'm sure you've seen a zillion posts about. I mean, now there are all these like probiotic supplements that are being touted to help with depression and anxiety. I've seen TikToks like saying like antibiotics are poison because they wipe out your microbiome and will cause, major depressive episodes and anxiety and all these things. I mean, it really feels like Sarah's like working up a sweat right now. She's like wiping her brow. She's like, what are these people saying? It just feels like such a distortion of what you're describing, Nicole. So what else can you share? Any other, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of misinformation and myths sort of about this link between nutrition and mental health. Anything else that you want to maybe debunk?
Sure. Yeah, there's lots. So it depends on how in depth you would like me to get, because I often see the SMILES trial being revered as this like amazing study that we should be modeling after, that's telling us that this is why diet and depression is so significant. So like, I could talk about that because I think that's important.
Let's do it.
It bugs me. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. So
you mentioned a SMILES trial. What is this?
So it's the SMILES trial. This was published in 2017. I think Jacka was the lead researcher on this. So basically what they did is they took, I think it was 30 participants, but they had clinically depressed individuals and they split them up into two groups. One group was the diet group. And so what they did for them is they had a diet. They had everyone meet with a registered dietitian for like 7 or 8 weeks to give them personalized nutrition advice in order to adhere to a Mediterranean style diet. They had food hampers that were sent to them. And in the control group, it was just called like a social support befriending group. So they met, at the same frequency at which the intervention group met with the dietitian, but they didn't change their diet. And it was 12 weeks, I believe. So they did some pre and post measures of some self-report symptoms of depression. And they reported at the end of the study that basically there was this huge significant difference from clinical symptoms pre-intervention to post-intervention after 12 weeks. And so the conclusion was that the Mediterranean diet is a dietary pattern that helps to decrease clinical symptoms of depression. That was really like the moral taken from that study. The reason why I have a particular problem with that is because they did not really account for the other interventions that were a part of that study. So they're highlighting that the one intervention, which was the dietary change, is the sole intervention that caused the decrease, when there was at least 3 or 4 other interventions that were introduced in the dietary group. So they used motivational interviewing. They had, personalized one-on-one meetings with a registered dietitian that create, that includes so much incredible support for a depressed person to have one-on-one help in order to change their diet is tremendous in terms of level of support. So I don't think any of that was really accounted for. And as a psychologist, one of the behavioral treatments that we use for depression is something called behavioral activation. And this is helping a person engage in adaptive behaviors so that they can access more pleasant like emotions and experiences and thoughts. And so I think that was part of what also was going on. Like, that's all my own thought process in terms of maybe the intervention that was going on. So the issue is that the SMILES trial is sort of like seen as this number one study that we should be revering, because this is what demonstrates that diet has this huge impact on clinical depression. Meanwhile, we're not accounting for all the other kinds of interventions and support that was provided to clinically depressed individuals in order to change their behavior. So
interesting. And I mean, I'm sure, I just want to clarify for listeners, like you wouldn't argue like people should be eating a, balanced and diverse diet, right? I mean, Sarah, you're always saying what's good for our body is going to be good for our mind, right?
You take the words right out of my mouth. Yes, I was literally about to say just that. You know me.
Do you want to finish the thought, though? Did you want to comment on what Nicole just said? Or did I
mean, no,
yeah.
it just makes perfect sense. I mean, it seems to me like this study was missing a very crucial control group, which is just the no interaction at all with any kind of support system. And like that would have been, I think, the true control in this type of experiment. I don't know why they didn't do that. But it's just like you said, it's really hard to say, like, what was it actually the change in diet, or was it the support that they were receiving in general? I mean, it's just sort of impossible to tease that apart.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I see quite a bit, Nicole, and it sounds like, was this I don't know, this was some sort of a prospective trial. I'm not sure, but I'm not familiar with the actual study, but I often see people looking at these like observational studies or cross-sectional studies in particular, like linking, let's say, a diet high in processed foods. And oh my goodness, I'm not even opening up that can of worms right now, unless you want to comment on it. There's a lot going on about processed foods and ultra-processed foods. But I don't know, I think about when I'm in, going through a particularly difficult time, if I'm experiencing, like even right now, I mean, not to be dark, but I'm going through it right now. I'm sort of having it's been a rough week for me, and I'm just, I'm not in the mood to cook a meal. And so I'm going to the get fast food, or I'm heating up TV dinners just because it's not what's causing now I'm talking about depression, but it's, people are basically like reverse causality. People are getting these things sort of confused. I just wanted to mention that as well. Do you have a comment though? And anything like people saying that, Doritos and chips and all these processed foods are, they're talking about ultra processed like snacks and stuff causing mental health issues. Any comment on that? She's just shaking her head, folks.
Yeah, no, my comment is just that it's wild to make that kind of claim. I mean, like Sarah mentioned, these are multifactorial, really complex disorders and diseases, and there's no singular root cause that causes any of them. And not only that, but like just what you just mentioned is so important from a clinical perspective, which is this, and this is what people who don't work clinically don't have access to, which is real people who are depressed just need to eat sometimes. Like behaviors get disrupted in depression. Some people lose their appetite completely. Some people overeat. Like we have to deal with trying to just on a basic level sometimes help a person get nourished, not exactly what their micronutrient profile is going to be, or if they had olive oil today. That doesn't make any sense. So there's really no good research that even supports that ultra processed foods significantly increases things like depression or things like anxiety disorders. There's no good research that really supports that. So I'm shaking my head because it's true. It is all over social media, and it's completely lacking in support. And from a real clinical perspective, it's absurd because once you actually start working with people who are really depressed, then you really have insight into what is necessary, to help people.
And I also I would also like to point out the lack of a rigorous definition for ultra processed food. Like what is that? You all know at this point that I love a definition. Like what is ultra processed food? Every food is processed. As I understand it, to some extent. Like, yes. How even are we defining this? I'm not on social media, so I don't really know what all is going on, but it sounds insane.
It's a dumpster fire, Sarah. Stay away. Protect yourself.
Stay away.
All right. Let's turn to the Heard from the Herd segment now, if we can. Heard from the Herd. We opened up a question box and folks submitted some questions. There were a bunch of great ones. Many you've already answered, but some that we haven't touched on. So let me see here. Okay, we've touched on the gut-brain connection. Lots of questions about panic versus anxiety. All right. Here we go. What is the vagus nerve connection to all of this? And I don't know which one of you want to jump in on that, but got lots of questions. Okay, she's grabbing her head. Nicole is looking distressed.
I'm looking distressed. Sarah, I would default to you because the only thing I will say is that the only time I ever heard about the vagus nerve is on social media. Never in my clinical training, in readings in terms of treatments for anxiety disorders, never have I encountered the importance of the vagus nerve. And so I only got introduced to this on social media. And so I don't know if I could even comment more on that, but please.
I mean, the vagus nerve is very important. It's one of our 10 cranial nerves. Like it is very important. And the gut-brain axis is definitely a thing. I mean, that is something that's been documented, well established. I mean, how the gut and the brain communicate has fascinated scientists for centuries. I mean, we've all heard the expression like listen to your guts, right? Like that's actually based on some real science. And basically what we're talking about when we say the gut-brain axis is the transformation of information via the vagus nerve, which connects our brain to our various organ systems. And it transforms information from our small intestine primarily to our brains and back again. So what's really cool about the gut-brain axis is it's actually a two-way street. So just really quick, 1,000-foot overview of the biology is that the small intestine is lined with villi, these like little finger-like protrusions. And these villi are made up of many types of cells. And one of these types of cells is called a neuropod. And neuropods are kind of like our gut sensors. And these cells, these neuropods, they synapse with nerves, including the vagus nerve, which runs right down the trunk of our body. And so they synapse with our vagus nerve. And these neuropod cells sense mechanical, thermal, and chemical stimuli, such as nutrients or bacterial byproducts in the gut lumen. And the vagus nerve, all that does is it carries the sensory information to the brainstem, which then links signals generated within the intestine to our brain and then back again.
Now, Sarah, you're so wonderfully innocent because you're taking a real scientific perspective on this. What you don't know on social media is that people are promoting vagus nerve massages as anxiety and depression treatments. So what you're saying is, yes, certainly there is something that is, biologically important with the vagus nerve.
Nerve?
Well, good question. I'm just looking.
That's why I was shaking my head.
That's why I was like grinning. I'm like, this is so great, but wait till she hears how people are distorting this. So, I mean, not to
nerves are inside our bodies, people. I just want to. They're not just hanging out outside. They can't be massaged.
Well, apparently they can. There are finger massages, there are ear massages, rib cage massages, neck massages. Then people saying things like breathing, humming, singing, gargling will stimulate the vagus nerve. And here, just my 2 cents, just as a human, like if I have someone massaging me, if I'm breathing, yeah, that's probably going to calm me down, right? But it's not stimulating the vagus nerve in a way that is having that effect. Would you co-sign that statement, Dr. Scheinman?
Yes.
Okay.
What? I'm so confused. I am so confused.
Yeah.
I love it.
My explanation about the vagus nerve, please, that is what the vagus nerve does. You cannot massage a nerve. It is inside your body. That's not a thing.
Okay. Thank you, Nicole. I love that we both we had this background knowledge. Sarah, this might be one of my new favorite things, shocking you with the social media of it all. All right.
Oh, 100%.
So
yeah, Sarah lives under a rock is going to be a theme of this whole of this podcast.
Yeah. I love it. All right, 2 more questions, and then I know we're getting ready to wrap up, but got a lot of questions about cortisol. There was one question in particular: does lowering your cortisol with things like ashwagandha help mentally and emotionally?
No good clinical research on that.
What is ashwagandha?
Exactly. It's like some kind of herbal extract. And I can't remember if it was the I think it was the American Psychological Association, but a few years ago, they published something they coalesced sort of all the research related to nutritional supplementation and what the evidence said for anxiety relief. And there's like not much. They basically kind of, listed a bunch of supplements and basically said there's not enough evidence to support recommendations for this use. So like, we don't have good evidence for it.
However, despite the lack of evidence, there's a huge market for these products. So I just did a very quick Google search. And I'm not going to call out companies. I'm not looking to do that. But there's something called Ritual Stress Relief, which includes ashwagandha, amino acids. This is being sold for $45 for a tiny bottle of supplements. I will say, now I will name a company, but Athletic Greens, AG1, is selling, they're calling it their stress and mood balance package. I don't know, this is some sort of a supplement, which includes ashwagandha adaptogens. That's a whole other thing. There are ashwagandha stress gummies. I mean, this is a long way of saying there's a huge market for this. And I mean, we've talked about this ad nauseum on the podcast. It's obviously the supplement industry is not held to the same standards as actual drugs and medications. And so people are taking these little seeds of potential. Who knows if there are any studies to support this, right? And then marketing and making a lot of money and preying on those of us who actually do suffer with these disorders. So I get absolutely crazy. I'm sure you really take issue with this too as well, Nicole.
It's really bad. It just appeals right to the naturalistic fallacy. It's just like that. What's natural is more superior, and so why let's take a supplement from like an herb versus like a psychiatric medication that's actually pretty effective.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, I just wanted to, for those who don't know, because I actually don't know exactly what ashwagandha is. It's a shrub that grows in the Middle East, India, and parts of Africa. It is a popular herb in traditional Indian medicine that is said to be used for stress relief and general health. So I just want to be sensitive. Like, yes, there are some real, cultural applications of these things, but when we actually dig into the science, there's not a whole lot of data supporting their use. All right. Mm-hmm. Last question. Hang on here. All right. Any relationship between alcohol and anxiety? And I just want to key this up. And Sarah, I know you have something to say about this. I will find, and this is not me saying people should go out and drink a ton or anything like that, but I will find that like the morning after I have had something to drink, like a couple of glasses of wine or something, I do seem like I'm more likely to experience like depression or some anxiety. Mm-hmm. I feel a little bit more on edge. Sarah, can you talk a little bit? Like, is there something going on neurobiologically there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, alcohol is a depressant, central nervous system depressant. And it's been known to, I mentioned some neurotransmitters earlier on, and alcohol has been known to affect the homeostatic balance of certain neurotransmitters in regions of the brain, specifically that regulate emotion and emotional processing. And this is why when you imbibe in alcohol, you experience a change in your emotional state. I mean, some euphoria, but then after a certain amount of time, you experience that withdrawal. Those withdrawal symptoms lead to drastic changes in emotion. And documented cases, documented increases in anxiety, increases in depression, like emotions. And this is all due to that just the homeostasis of your brain just going all out of whack from the alcohol. And I also wanted to mention too that people that have anxiety disorders, and Nicole, you probably experience this in your practice, very frequently have comorbid alcoholism and addiction because they use it as a maladaptive coping mechanism and a way of sort of self-medicating these negative emotions that are kind of so hard to regulate without proper treatment. And I think like 1 in 4 people that have an anxiety, only 1 in 4 people that have an anxiety disorder actually receive proper treatment. So a lot of people will turn to drugs or alcohol to try and alleviate some of the unpleasant anxiety.
Nicole, any final thoughts or anything you wanted to add to that, or just the larger discussion we've had today?
No, yeah, I see that in terms of like my practice. Sometimes there's some maladaptive use of alcohol, and just like to your point, like it is common for people to experience, especially like the physiological symptoms for after alcohol. Like there sometimes can mimic physiological symptoms of anxiety for people, like your heart racing or stuff like that. So that can certainly influence like and exacerbate feelings of anxiety. So it would be good to really like decrease use, or to really try not, to use alcohol especially like while you're experiencing like a height of like an anxiety disorder.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Nicole. This was really a great conversation. I feel like there are many more myths that we'll have to bust together. You all should definitely go ahead and follow Dr. Nicole. Why did I say Nicole? Sorry. Dr. Nicole Littman-Barilli is it Instagram? Are you on other platforms as well, or is Instagram your main one?
Instagram's my main one. I'm on TikTok, but I have no idea what I'm doing on TikTok.
Girl, same. Yeah. And you can follow Nicole at Feed Your Mental. Thank you all so much for your ongoing support. A reminder that we do a weekly newsletter. We never put anything behind a paywall, so it's free to subscribe on Substack. It's theunbiasedscipod.substack.com. But if you are able and inclined, there is a paid subscription which helps support our efforts. Certainly follow along on social media. We continue to put out our daily infographics. And yeah, please subscribe if you aren't subscribed on YouTube. Leave us a review. All the things that I'm supposed to be saying. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And with that, Sarah, would you like to take us home?
Yeah, we hope you learned a thing or two. Thanks for tuning into the pod, your trusted source for no nonsense, just science.